Thank you. I'm happy to be here tonight. There are really two themes in the book, and one of them is that the weaknesses that confront the United States now in many ways overlap with those that confronted the previous leading world economic powers, Britain and Holland back when New York was New Amsterdam, and Habsburg Spain, and even you can go back and find some similarities with Rome. Now, I won't pursue this very much because I have a fairly short period of time. The essence of these parallels involve religion and military overstretch, debt, something of a disenlightenment when science seems to be pushed aside by religion, which was true in Rome and true in certainly in Spain, and even in a way in Britain, which is an irony. All of this is relevant in the United States now. Now, the title of the book, American Theocracy, suggests that almost necessarily that we have something resembling a theocracy. Now, yes, but also no. No, not in the sense of Massachusetts Bay when the Puritans, or John Calvin's Geneva, or the early Utah of the Mormons, back when they were, the Book of Mormon was indulging all kinds of odd quirks on what they call Christianity today, but contrary, I think, to the governor of Massachusetts, it may be a hard sell. And that's going to be my only digression into local politics. But realistically, in a major nation, especially one as diverse and as large, you're not going to have anything approximating the sort of theocracy that is talked about in schools and textbooks. And what I'll try to talk about tonight in these 12, 15 minutes is really the basis for saying that this has strong aspects of theocracy, that what's going on in the United States today represents a considerable transformation and one that should really be of great concern. Now, let me start with sort of the unfolding of the circumstances that are involved here. As was mentioned in my book, The Emerging Republican Majority, one of the things it predicted was that the South would move into the Republican Party. At that stage in 1968, what we got was the so-called Outer South. This was the Tennessee, Virginia, North Carolina, Florida, Texas. Not that we got Texas, but that was the aim for it. Those states, not the Deep South, which was Wallace country. But as soon as the third party flirtations were over with, then the South fell into the hands of the Republicans. Now, what has happened, in my opinion, is that the South has basically taken over the Republican Party in the sense the southernization of it has gone far beyond the transitional period of the 60s and 70s. And the rise of the religious right has been part of this too. And the growth within the United States during this period, and the statistics are really very striking, of a whole set of new churches, evangelical, Pentecostal, fundamentalists that replaced in importance the so-called mainline Protestant denominations. And the statistics at this point, whatever you might think if you were in some of the nicer sections of metropolitan Boston or in Connecticut or so forth, the future religiously is in these evangelical and Pentecostal and fundamentalist sects, and that they have grown and they have ballooned, and they are part of a redrawing of the map of the United States politically. Now, because the Republican Party picked up the South, basically, the combination of its constituency in the Middle West, the Rocky Mountains, and the border states with the South has created a sharp balance of religious sentiment in the United States within the Republican coalition. The Democrats tend to be much more secular, although there is still obviously in states like especially those in New England or Pennsylvania or what have you, a very large sort of mainstream Catholic element in the Democratic Party. But that's been fading recently, and what we're starting to see now is something that's really very significant in the sense that one of the major students of religious political science, John Green of the University of Ohio, said as early as 1988, we're starting to see the emergence of religious political parties in the United States. And some of you who are historians will say, well, didn't we have that sort of thing at times in American history? Well, you certainly had parties that represented a religion or several religions. In New England, the Protestants would have been largely Republican and the Catholics largely Democrats, let's say, in the 1920s or what have you. But you could always find an example of the most religious people of one group or another that weren't part of the so-called religious coalition. When you had the Whigs or the Federalists with most of the religious people in the Northeast, the religious people who were Southern Baptists or all kinds of other minor sects in the South tended to be Democrats, and the more religious they were, that made no difference. But what we've got emerging in this country now, or I should say it's emerged already and it's becoming more obvious and people are talking about it, is that the bulk of the people who are frequent church attenders or attenders of religious services, be they Protestant, Catholic, or Jewish, are the ones that are more Republican. And among the Protestant denominations, obviously, while it's true across the board, it's especially true of the evangelicals, fundamentalists, and Pentecostals. Within the Catholic Church, it's also true, though, that the most frequent attenders at services are the most Republican. And within the Jewish group, it's the Orthodox, whether it's the Lubavitchers or the sort of red hots who in Israel were part of the Likud coalition, and actually they're even more Republican in the last election than the white Southern evangelicals, because it worked out to be about 92 or 93%. And the Jewish trend to Bush, which wasn't very pronounced, but was 5 or 6 points, was largely because of the increased participation of the huge families of the Orthodox Jews. So there's really no precedent for this in the sense that the most religious of the principal biblically related religions are the most supportive of George W. Now, this is not entirely a coincidence because his role in the religification of the Republican Party has been quite striking. In 1985 and 86, he was in the middle of his not very successful career as an oil man in Texas, and the price of oil tanked. And about this time, he was also finding considerable comfort in the bottle of a bourbon glass, and it was, generally a kind of tough period for him. And as often is the case, it's a personal crisis that leads to a religious conversion, and he was born again. And that's been much discussed in various publications. But during 1987 and 1988, he served as his father's liaison man with a religious right. And he basically was responsible for going and pitching these constituencies for his father, because a lot of people had a sense of George H.W. Bush as the type of Republican who trimmed the ivy on the Episcopal Church. And that wasn't exactly their thing. So George W. was the liaison who sort of brought them into the fold. And for example, he arranged a meeting between his parents and Jim and Tammy Faye Baker. And I'm sure Barbara Bush enjoyed that enormously, it must have. But what it suggested was the degree of personal involvement that George W. had in moving the party in this direction. Then when he became governor of Texas, he was the governor of the state in which the combination of big business and corporations and the evangelical and most religious people was a fait accompli. That was probably the best example of a big state in which that alliance was well established. So by the time he gets to run in 2000, he's got a number of things working for him. The whole change in the South and in the makeup of the Republican Party, the rise of the religious right, his own skills in dealing with these groups, and more than that, he had another set of circumstances. Now, what he had was the moral impression that Bill Clinton made on church-going America. Now, again, this is not a huge constituency in Cambridge, Massachusetts. So it's difficult for you to imagine what it's like to be you know, at the First Pentecostal Church of Appalachia, Alabama, or something like that. It's impossible to imagine. And as the population has moved south and west and the Sun Belt has grown up, and every census you see Massachusetts losing another seat, New York losing another seat, Pennsylvania, whatever. And, you know, there's parts of Texas that had no water 100 years ago that have more congressmen now than Massachusetts. So that there's a huge trend here, and the fact that very few of you know these people means nothing. It really doesn't, you know, it's just not there. Now, in terms of what this has meant for George W., well, if you follow his sort of religious comments and promises and hints over the years, in 1999 and 2000, there were a number, and anybody that wants to find this on the internet can find all of it. It's very easy to find. It's not very credentialed. I mean, they don't have tapes of these things or anything, but he spoke to groups in which he said he believed that God wanted him to be president, and he would say that he had been picked, or it was, he never said he had a conversation then or anything, but that was the general thrust of it. And there were several groups of preachers that he spoke to that they won't release the transcript. And my guess is that they actually spoke about some of the concerns of the religious right that they would not want to be discussing or want to have discussed. Now, by the time that 9/11 rolled around, and all of this is in great detail in my book, so I'll just say more or less what's involved here. There was a lot of analysis by professors of religion and others that the Bush speeches were really very double-coded, that there was this sense of a fight between good and evil, and he would cite the Bible, and he would refer to the evil one and things like that. But he actually, below a lot of these easy symbolisms, he had reference to the important words from hymns and portions of the Bible, and this has been analyzed at great length by several professors, and it's fascinating and sort of appalling to read it, because if you read a bin Laden speech that's been analyzed and parsed, you get the sense of that he too sees a world of good and evil, and he thinks he's fighting in his own religion's cause and so forth, and you can see real parallels between the way that the two men cast it. Now, as he went into Iraq, it was very clear that a major element of his coalition favored going into Iraq. They didn't want to hear about oil, and they probably didn't care about weapons of mass destruction. The history of Iraq in sort of millennial discourse in the last 50 years is pretty significant. There's several political scientists have noted and quoted people saying that when the Soviet Union basically fell apart in the late 1980s, the evangelicals shifted their focus that the evil was now Islam. And they analyzed how this went back to the Crusades and many other things, because even the British in their last 50 or 70 years of colonialism before World War I, even though it lasted even longer than that, you were basically fighting Islam, and the British had worked themselves into a sense of crusades. And when, horrible as it is to say, Newsweek ran the story and nobody followed it up except some of the British newspapers. Bush, while he was getting ready to roll into Iraq, was reading a book of sermons and observations by a chaplain with the British Army who was with the British Army as they were in Egypt, waiting to invade and retake Jerusalem. So this is what George W. Bush is reading, and about how you have to put yourself in the hands of God and all of this. And when Allenby finally did get into Jerusalem in December 1917, he basically said, now the last crusade is over. So the underpinnings religiously of all of this, it was amazing that it didn't get picked up except by several of the British papers, where they basically said that it's unbelievable that this man is reading these things when what he should be reading about is what a total cropper all of this religious conviction came in World War I, after they were totaling up the bodies and the havoc of the whole thing, and it didn't solve anything, and just laid the groundwork for World War II. But the British had thought otherwise. And Bush has a very selective capacity for history, although I hesitate to knock his grades in history because I understand that he did slightly better than John Kerry, which says that Democrats don't have all the answers either. So to come back to George W. and his particular brand of religion, after the invasion of Iraq in 2003, he was quoted in Middle East newspapers. He talked to some of the Palestinian leadership. I think it was the outgoing prime minister. And basically what he was quoted as saying, God told me to invade Afghanistan, and I did. God told me to invade Iraq, and I did. And I'm going to bring peace, or something like that. Now, the White House, which almost never comments on these things, has denied this categorically. So I can only say that it is totally denied by the White House, and I don't know whether it's true or not. However, the one that kind of gets me, which I quote in the book, this was when George Bush visited the Old Order Amish in Pennsylvania in 2004. And what he did was he went and he told them, this was in private, but it was reported by the Lancaster New Era, which is a small paper there. He said basically he couldn't do his job without knowing that he spoke for God. Now, several of the people analyzing all of his words have parsed it that he really does think this, that he sees himself in a prophetic role and that he's serving a godly purpose. After 9/11, the Washington Post did a survey of the leaders of the religious right in Washington, and they found a general belief among them that God must have known about the talents of George W. and that he was the man chosen for the occasion. And it concluded, and this is more or less a quote, and it's close to what I have in the book, that for the first time in history, the leader of the religious right in the United States was also the President of the United States. Now, what does all this mean? Well, it means a lot of things. It means that you have a Republican coalition which is very heavily weighted towards the sort of people who worry about biblical inerrancy, who basically believe in Noah's Ark and the creation of the earth and however many years it's been around and so forth and so on. And, you know, again, you'll say, but, you know, all the Republicans that we know live in Andover and Weston, and they don't believe that garbage, you know. Well, congratulations. You have some idea of how much Andover and Weston count in the scheme of things? And it's true. The people that matter in the Republican coalition are these people in other places. And as I mentioned, roughly 46% of Christian Americans in a Newsweek poll right around the millennium said they believed in the Armageddon and the end times, and they believed that the Antichrist was already alive. Now, if you analyze this to match the Republican coalition, since the Republican coalition has most of the religious people, you probably get something like 55 or 60% of the people who voted for George W. Bush in 2000 would have answered these questions that they believed. Now, this is a backdrop, in my opinion, for certainly some of their language and probably some of their decision-making in terms of Iraq, because Saddam Hussein is perceived as again was noted briefly by some people, as if not the Antichrist, the one who's going to pave the way. And Baghdad was the original Babylon, and the books by Tim LaHaye, the fundamentalist preacher, talk about the Antichrist has his headquarters in New Babylon. And I can't help but imagine that people in the White House knew that they had to adjust some of their language to fit this sense on the part of a huge element of their coalition. How much they considered and based their actions on this, I have no idea. I wouldn't go that far. Let me stop here because I've done my 15 minutes, but this is to suggest what sort of ingredients there are in this package of how closely elements of this have begun to move, as much as I can imagine a major country like this could move in the direction of elements of theocracy. And if you look at the questions that people were asked in polls about whether religious leaders should play a role and whether politicians should look to religion for guidance and so forth, it's always the Republicans and the evangelicals that are favorable, and sometimes lopsidedly, and it's the mainline Protestants and the seculars who are lopsided against. And if you were to see a survey of Reformed Jews, they'd be lopsided against too, but they tend not to break it out on that level. So let me stop here, and I'll be glad to pick up on any questions you have, or to insult any other politician who's thinking about running, or whatever would be of use. Thank you.
You're joining us at Cambridge Forum listening to Kevin Phillips discussing American theocracy, religion, money, and oil. Mr. Phillips, let me ask the first question, which is, in surveying the American South for your first book, The Emerging Republican Majority, what did you see then that is different from what you see now?
Well, in terms of looking at religion, at that point, practically nothing. I went back and looked at the analysis in this book, which was essentially written before the 1968 election, but updated for that. But it included nothing about 1972. We hadn't gotten to that point yet. By 72, you could see that there was a major change developing in the Republican electorate because of the hostility among churchgoers in the South to George McGovern. I remember those numbers. It's just mind-blowing. The Republicans have never since gotten as high a percentage of the white electorate in the South as they got in 1972. And only in retrospect can we now go back and see that the Southern Baptist Convention, which is the only religious body named Southern in the country, and it was the Confederate Church after the Civil War, and it's now the biggest Protestant church in the United States, expanded all across the South into across the Ohio, up into Kansas and Nebraska, out west, even up to Alaska. It's one of the 4 biggest denominations in Alaska. So I wasn't looking for this at that point. My assumption in terms of Southern politics was that it was a mixture of culture, racial issues, a sense of small-town identification, patriotism in Vietnam. A lot of Southern soldiers were there. That was the part of the country that supported it the longest and the most. So I really, at that point, didn't deal with that issue. But if you look at that coalition in 2000 and 2004, you see a very different coalition. And one of the charts that I put in, which I think is very revealing, is to take 13 or 14 northeastern states that we now basically think of, or northeastern and Midwest and Western states that we think of as generally more liberal, and see by how much Eisenhower in 56, Nixon in 72, and Reagan in 84 carried them. And then to see the very large losses below those Eisenhower, Nixon, Reagan levels on the part of George W. Bush. And where did George W. Bush do best in comparison with Reagan and these others? West Virginia, Kentucky, Tennessee, Alabama, essentially the states that have been changed the most by the mobilization of the poor white evangelicals, fundamentalists, and Pentecostals. So it's not something that people have gotten into too much, and I don't think too many people know the details, but it is a very, very different coalition than it was 30-odd years ago.
Let me ask a second question. You've described what can seem to many unacquainted with it as a tsunami sweeping over the United States, and yet in retrospect, George Bush didn't win the popular vote in 2000 and didn't win by an enormous amount in 2004. And the fact is that a lot of this theocratic America is bulked up in states where it ends up being substantially more than a simple majority and is more thinly spread in critical states like Ohio. What do you think will make what could make a difference in 2008 that would trim their effectiveness outside their core base?
Well, it's interesting that the core base, it's hard to say what the core base is, because right after the 2004 election, where Ohio was supposedly the one that was going to determine it, and I really think he carried it. I don't believe the people who say that that doesn't ring true, because no Republican could carry West Virginia and Kentucky and Indiana by the margins that he did and not carry the state that abuts all 3. And in my opinion, he must have carried it. But if you look at the development since the election, the First thing, the Southern Baptist Convention, which has almost 20 million members in the United States, did after the election of any major note was to announce that metropolitan Cleveland was going to be its target city for the year. And basically what they want to do, the western part of, metropolitan Cleveland was the old Western Reserve of Connecticut, and that was settled from New England. And the part of Ohio where the Republicans do best now is essentially the southern part that was settled from the south and was German settled, because one of the bulwarks of the Republican coalition is rural German Catholics and Lutherans from Ohio all the way out to the Dakotas. I mean, just enormous margins. But what happened in a nutshell is that they decided to move into Ohio. There's now a fight in the Republican Party to take control of it for the religious types. I'm not aware of the present circumstances. I've got speeches in Ohio in a couple of weeks, but I don't know exactly what's been happening. It's really dividing the Republican Party there, but the big trends in the last election, if you work them out in the county by county, these were all places where the Southern Baptist Convention was very substantial. There are 6 counties in Ohio where it's the largest Protestant denomination, and these are, it's the Appalachianization of Ohio, round 2. You know, a whole bunch of people from West Virginia, Tennessee, and Kentucky came north during the 20s and 30s to work in the industrial plants, and now in some respects there's another wave. And the growth of the sectarian churches as opposed to the Episcopalians and the Presbyterians of America and the Congregationalists and such like is really quite substantial there. So I think demographically they're winning the Battle of Ohio, but politically they may not be, because I think they run a huge risk that in these areas that were settled from Connecticut and still have a few congregational churches, that some of these upscale suburbs are going to have roughly the same view that Greenwich, Connecticut does. And I can tell you, when my book American Dynasty came out 2 years ago, while I see people from Greenwich and other places in Connecticut where we live, I was never asked to speak at the big Greenwich bookstore. But, you know, they're right online this time. And the Republican congressman from Fairfield County, Connecticut, has said the party of Lincoln has become the party of a theocracy. Chris Shays from Fairfield County. So it's really pretty significant, and they're spreading, and I'm not sure how the politics will work out, but these movements religiously are still growing. And in the West, they actually include many, many non-whites. They have Asians and Filipinos and Latin Americans and so forth, considerable numbers. And they're sort of in a southern sphere of influence, even though they don't realize it, because they take positions that are in many ways compatible with the Southern Baptist Convention in Alabama or Mississippi.
Third question for me, and then we'll turn to the audience. The growth of Hispanic population in the Southwest and now spreading into the South has been the ace that Democrats have been holding out as their protection against the expansion of white theocratic conservatism. What's your reaction?
Well, it's not an ace. Maybe it's a jack and maybe it's a 10, but it's not an ace. The Pentecostal movement among Hispanics is enormous. And if you look at the percentage of Pentecostals who are Catholic and Protestant, the percentage of Hispanics who are Catholic and Protestant, you now get 60-something to 30-something, so that the Protestantization of the Hispanics, and a lot of it's Pentecostal, and the Pentecostal, the Assemblies of God and some of the others, are the absolute zenith of religious intensity. John Ashcroft was a Pentecostal, and when he took office, he had himself anointed with cooking oil in the manner of King David. That was, so, you know, I would say that probably not too many Hispanic Pentecostals are into that yet, but certainly plenty of them are voting Republican, and the notion that that's some ace is dubious. Although on the other hand, if the Democrats ever find a voice on economic issues and a voice against the extremism that's there in the Republican Party religiously, and I'm not sure I think they will, they should have a certain amount of luck.
You're listening to Kevin Phillips discussing American theocracy. Let's take some questions from the audience. Please use the microphone in the aisle.
Thank you, Professor Parker. Mr. Phillips, I'm Jerome Marion from St. Paul's Roman Catholic Church, just across the way here. It seems that Roman Catholics and Unitarians have more points of unity with one another, despite great points of difference in theology, when it comes to how we see political responsibility exercised in this country. And you describe in very good detail in your book the enormous gap between Episcopalians, Methodists, Presbyterians, Catholics, Unitarians, and so forth on the one side, the Pentecostalists, the fundamentalists, and the evangelicals on the other. My question for you is it possible that there are two factors emerging just now that might shift this? The first factor is that the evangelicals are beginning to come to consciousness of the stewardship of creation, of the need to stand up and fight against global warming. They're even willing to take on the financial and the oil interests in the Republican Party on these issues. If that's the first factor, there's also a second factor. If someone like Mark Warner or another Democrat who can speak to these people emerges in the party, do you see those two factors coming together and reversing this tide? Thank you.
Well, the first is the role potentially of some of the evangelicals in a more liberal set of issue agendas, one of which is the environment. I'm familiar with what's happening there, and it has some significance, but I don't think a whole lot, because the number of evangelicals involved in this have a lot of access to the media and are talked about, but I suspect that as against the weight in a lot of these very conservative southern jurisdictions, it doesn't amount to too much. And the second part, I forget, do you remember the second part of that? Mark Warner. Well, I have a lot of trouble taking him seriously as winning a national race. The Democratic core constituencies will dominate the primaries like the Republican ones dominate in the Republican primaries, and I would assume that would favor somebody much more liberal. Now, Hillary Clinton, I don't think can win a general election, but she does have star quality, and I would think she's the favorite, if she wants to run, to get the nomination. So I'm not sure that I see too much developing on either of those fronts. I should say that there is a growing right-wing Catholic element in Washington, which includes people like Justice Scalia, Senator Sam Brownback, and others, really involved with what used to be thought as some of the fringes of Austrian conservative Catholicism in the 19th century. Now, that's not very big either, but it's an interesting nuance. And part of what you're saying, and I think is very important, is that on a lot of dimensions, the importance of Catholicism versus Protestantism has almost fallen apart as a voting issue. And in states like Alabama and Oklahoma in 1980, the Republicans elected as new senators from those states were Roman Catholics, very conservative. But 30 years earlier, you never would have imagined that you'd have A, a Catholic senator, or B, he'd be a Republican. So that a lot of the old yardsticks are not very good here. There's lots of stuff happening.
I have two questions, both of which are related. First is that once George W. Bush leaves office, does the American theocracy continue? Or is it dependent upon him being in office? And the second part of my question is, how do we see change? Do you think that people who are interested in making progressive changes in the areas of environment, particularly, for example, ought to find people who are within these evangelical collection that can make that? Or is that always impossible, and we always ought to be outsiders, but play that game and hopefully win at some time down the lane?
Let me take your second one first. I'm not certain of how much change is going to come from the impact of the evangelicals on the environmental movement. You take a lot of these states, whether or not they're Alabama or West Virginia or whatever, there's an environmental movement, but it's not the most powerful thing around, and I wouldn't hold that out as being terribly significant. Now, the other part of the question was?
How much of this is related to
To Bush, yes.
own personal, and how much disappears when he leaves office?
Well, a lot could disappear if he leaves office, regarded as how did we ever elect this guy? And I think that there's a real possibility of this. And I think it's also possible that a lot of the evangelicals are starting to say, if God was talking to him about what to do in Iraq, he must have gotten it wrong. You know? You start trying to figure out what George Bush knows, you know, his strategic insights, 75 cents will buy you a candy bar. I mean, there are plenty of people down south, I think, that are waking up to this. Now, however, having said that, you have the federal judiciary at such a turning point that a couple of years' worth of appointments on the Supreme Court and the federal appeals courts and the district courts can put a fair amount of stuff in place for big trouble in judicial decisions. Now, they may get reversed when they get up to the appellate level or overridden in the Supreme Court. But supposedly Sandra Day O'Connor is very upset about what's happening to her seat and the changing balance that will come from her replacement. So I don't know. I wouldn't predict on this, because if the Democrats gain in these elections, they can probably help block judicial nominees that would take this further. But there's always a possibility. Now, bear in mind, those of you who say, well, you know, it can't hurt if the Democrats don't make too many big gains. Oh, yes, it can from your standpoint, or from even mine, despising some of what Bush does. If the Democrats don't do well in these elections, the Republicans can actually take considerable heart from that, because the midterm elections in the second term of a president are when the big gains are always made. And if you've got a president whose ratings are down in the 33, 34, 35%, and it's this president in this election, the midterms in the second term, and the Democrats don't make major gains, then I think the Democrats are going to have an incredible amount of soul searching to do, and the Republicans will say, even with Abramoff, even with 34%, even with Iraq screwed up, we didn't lose much. And that would unleash a lot. Now, the Democrats, in terms of election strategy, are not usually the sharpest tacks in the hardware store, not for a long time. And I don't know whether that's going to change this year or not. So there's a lot that's out there that's pretty dubious. I don't know.
Yeah. Sir, when do you think this ascendancy of religious fundamentalism will end?
Well, what happened in Britain that really put the kibosh on religion, which included evangelical religion, was the impact of World War I. And the churches were blamed for jingoism, and that applied not just to the Church of England, but to the nonconformist churches. And I think if something really goes wrong for this country in the next 15 years, sure, for a while, the people that are looking for the end times and Armageddon will be able to say all these horrible events only prove that it's about to happen. But if you get enough calamities and it turns out that there's no rapture and there's no second coming and there's just a mess, and that was true, that was World War I think it would have major effects in the United States for something like that to happen over 10 to 15 years, in which the religious predictions just didn't come true at all. And that the people who were promoting them would lose a lot of credibility.
As I understand it, you've focused on three issues: the theocracy, which you talked about tonight, the overwhelming debt, and the oil industry and oil depletion. Where does the abrogation of law fit in all this? We have a situation now where habeas corpus goes away, the rules of war go away, the Geneva Convention goes away, we torture, we have Abu Ghraib, we have Guantanamo. And this, to many of us, has been just as frightening and just as wrong a turn in our national affairs as the issues you've talked about. And I wonder, where do you see this fitting in anywhere?
I think to single out this particular episode, and I'm not certain it really should be called a war, but enough people accept that you have to at least contemplate the terminology, and not look at what's happened in other wars in other countries is a mistake. If you go back, Franklin D. Roosevelt in World War II interned all the Japanese, obviously a violation of their civil rights. In World War I, they had what were called the Palmer raids, when there was just a big Red Scare right in 1918 and 1919, especially 1919, and all kinds of liberties were violated again there too. Abraham Lincoln suspended habeas corpus during the Civil War. The extent to which Americans during the Revolutionary War were violating, of course there was no constitution, but the treatment of Tories and such like would never have stood up to the present Constitution. So I would say this stuff happens in wars. There's more of it this time. I think it fits a larger pattern, and it's trying to, it's taking shape because of terrorism in the sense that you're fighting evil and you can do anything you want. That's a new aspect, but in the sense of these standards being different in wartime periods, I think they always have been. And I would hesitate to jump in on this until the public has slid away a few notches from the sense that if it's really a crisis, you can wiretap and everything. It's still happening, but I don't think it's gone far enough. I think it's a great mistake for the Democrats to talk about censuring him or impeaching him, because it makes conservatives who are starting to think that he doesn't have all his marbles say, you know, it doesn't matter whether he has all these marbles, you know, he's our whatever. And so I wouldn't do that. It's too bad that the United States doesn't have what California had with Gray Davis. You know? A recall mechanism. Can you imagine how many recall petitions would be on the streets of Boston tomorrow?
In American business in the last 25 years, there's a theory of moral leadership that has grown up that bears a certain kind of resemblance to some of the theocratic notions of moral leadership, a kind of undemocratic assumption that moral leadership is exercised from the top down and that values are led from the top. We see this in politics as well. I'm wondering if there's a quiet movement called spirituality at work that's happening. I don't know if you've followed that or not, but I'm wondering if you see any possibility of that some of this is being fed by a corporate ideology as well as a religious ideology.
Well, I think that's probably right. The whole dog-eat-dog ethic and the survival of the fittest, which was associated with the robber barons back in the 19th century, I think there's something like it operating again today. Certainly the people running corporations consider themselves absolutely the fittest because they have 500 times the salary of the average worker and take home incredible packages even if they mess up the company. So there's an arrogance that's developed there that's enormous. Again, basically accepted by most of the politicians because they need the money from the money culture.
I think one of the great failings is the lack of a liberal vision, a robust liberal vision. And for those of us who are, let's say, liberal and believe in God, there's a real problem in that, you know, God has become the property of the Republican Party. And after 9/11, I had a ticket out to Washington that was stopped after the attacks, and I was on one of the first planes out. When I got to Washington, I was drawn to the Jefferson Memorial, and when I got there, right up front was Jefferson's statement, and I'm reminded of Washington's letter to the Jews in Newport, of the American deist idea that God exists, but there is no right way to worship. And this idea that the evangelicals have that this is a Christian nation is totally un-American if you go back to the original sources. And I'm just wondering, from, let's say, the standpoint of going back to a true American vision of many, many different religions being equal rather than being tolerated by a Christian majority.
Well, keep in mind that that was a federal circumstance, but in the state of Massachusetts, the state of New Hampshire, and the state of Connecticut, well into the 19th century, had established congregational churches. And the protections against the church-state connection applied only. The 14th Amendment hadn't taken them into regulating the states derivatively. So you can talk about theism in Washington, but you had Puritanism in the white churches of Massachusetts.
But what about now? I mean,
No, all I'm saying is there's no then to go back to that's as clear as what you make it to be, because at the state level it was perfectly legitimate by the jurisprudence of the time to have a state congregational church in Massachusetts or New Hampshire or Connecticut. So a lot of the people who favor a religious connection now say that it's an exaggeration to say that there was no religious connection back then, because obviously the Constitution was only aimed at the federal level. We had so many different religions that you couldn't have a state church, but it did nothing to stop a state church in the states that wanted to have it in New England, which was the only place they wanted it.
Thank you.
So it's more complex, and both sides are using this stuff back and forth.
Yeah, if I had to summarize American politics at the highest level, I would say it's an alliance between the Republican Party and corporate America, with the radical right supplying maybe the electoral base, but not really being the driving force for policy. To take Iraq, for example, I mean, besides Bush, who do we have involved in decision-making there? The key people are, of course, Rumsfeld and Cheney, but also Wolfowitz, Pearl, Libby, Faith. These are not people who are out of the religious right at all.
They're not there now.
Yeah, well, look, Cheney and Rumsfeld most certainly are.
Sure, but
to turn
the
this
actual neoconservatives.
Yes, they're gone.
Yeah.
But certainly many of the driving forces of policy in the Bush administration are not out of the religious right. So it seems to me that the driving influence is still an elite that is increasingly out of touch with the American people. I guess to turn this into a question for you, I guess I would ask you what you think of Thomas Frank's thesis, which basically, as I understand it, is that while the religious right may supply the electoral base, they don't get much in the way of policy for their votes.
Well, they don't get much in the way of policy if you think in terms of a sort of secular formation of policy, if you think in terms of good roads, honest civil servants, the right pensions, a fair set of tax policies, attention to the environment. But that isn't what a lot of them are thinking about. And if you were to, he picked Kansas, obviously, as an example of a state that shouldn't be voting the way it is. Well, all you have to do is take a religious census of Kansas, and you know that one of the headquarters of the Southern Baptist Convention is in Wichita. It's a major Baptist area, which is almost as southern as Oklahoma or some of the adjacent or nearby parts of Missouri and Tennessee and Kentucky. The whole notion that this is, that in the religious arena, the corporations still manage it. They don't care enough. They're happy to have them as allies. And they will support them on most of these religious issues unless and until somebody says that all the daughters of executive vice presidents of major corporations in Wilton, Connecticut can't have abortions. But since you're not going to have that sort of specific legislation, it's not likely to be too tough. Essentially, if you see the meetings of the lobbies in Washington, the corporate people, especially the oil industry that's colluded with them for a long time in Oklahoma and Texas and Louisiana, is very much attuned to recognizing that that's part of the alliance, and what they want, give it to them, because they basically support what we want in the oil-related and economic arenas, and they do.
But you wouldn't necessarily call them a subordinate part of the alliance, the religious right?
No, I wouldn't, and that's the principal thing, and partly because of George Bush. So when I was asked what would happen to this after he left, my feeling is that when he leaves, it can't be as strong, except that if it has more of the judiciary, it could have something it doesn't even have yet, because 2 years more of appointments could make it something that couldn't be undone. So that's why I have trouble answering that one. But I really don't think that the corporate America is as much in the saddle as it was before the religious right rose up to power, and you've got the whole emphasis on morality and good versus evil, and then Bush after Clinton. I think that has changed some of the balance of power in the Republican Party, and lobbyists in Washington agree with that.
My question is more posed towards the psychology of the religious right and what they view this alliance as serving. And a question boils down to, what would it take for the religious right to break between the policy goals which are served by the current coalition vis-a-vis concentration of wealth, et cetera, things addressed in your previous books, and the fairly clear prescriptions that are present in the New Testament, don't kill people, rich man, I have a needle, et cetera.
Yeah.
So I was really stunned and demoralized. It was several years ago, and I don't remember the exact state and exact governor. I'm sure you will.
Alabama.
Alabama, where the governor had his road to Damascus conversion
Yep.
and said, "Come with me," and they all said no. I'm wondering, what does it take to make the switch between being right and being good?
Well, they're going to have to be, I think that the leadership of the religious right and the Republicans allied to it, which in a lot of these states is pretty powerful, have to be embarrassed in ways that weren't remotely achieved by the governor in Alabama, who raised some of these issues, but there were too many interest groups in the state that were faithful to the old alliance, so to speak, and made it work. I think that you have to see an embarrassment in this politics on a very major national level. And considering that Iraq is right in the middle of the Bible lands and has everything from old Babylon to New Babylon and everything, if this really goes down the drain like it looks it could, how people can imagine that George Bush knows what he's doing in this area. I think that he's lost an enormous amount of credit already. At a certain point, you have to wonder. I mean, you could make the case at a certain stage that his incompetence is almost an atheist plot, because you've got a situation where if if God spends half of his time talking to George Bush and Pat Robertson, how much can you really expect? So I think the potential for all of this to be embarrassing is a very high one. But it's not with the Democrats, because they're all afraid they're going to be accused of not going to church more than 3 times a year, and they'll get in big trouble, so they don't want to raise the issues. But circumstances can force the issues out.
I mean, it seems like there's low-hanging fruit in regarding Ralph Reed and his connections to Jack Abramoff. I mean, are these going to sell or play? Pat Robertson and conflict diamonds and being involved at a direct level in bloody wars in Africa.
That's right. I mean, you want to tell me about how crummy a lot of them are? I mean,
I'm sure you do.
But what does it take to make it play politically? Is the question.
It's hard for them to do, because somebody who basically stands up and says, I want to bring true honesty and morality to American politics, then they go out and do a profile of what he's been up to. I mean, when Newt Gingrich was leading the fight against Clinton for fooling around, Newt was fooling around. And then so was the guy who was going to replace him, Livingston. And some of you may remember that speech where I was hoping, actually, because I could never stand Bill Clinton, but that Livingston, by basically saying, I'm a dirtbag and I'm going to resign, basically, who else is a dirtbag and who else should resign? But I think that you're assuming that the force of all of this is larger than maybe it is. People are so disgusted, and young people just laugh at it. That's all these programs that do nothing but jerk them. I mean, they show George Bush saying the moon is blue, and then in the next sentence he's saying the moon is green, and the next sentence there is no moon, and nobody cares. Well, I can't say nobody cares, but nobody cares enough. And a lot of young people say, well, what would you expect? And you probably shouldn't expect too much. But when I was a kid, they had a series. The older people here will remember this. These were all the stamps with the pictures of the presidents. There's a 3-cent purple with Thomas Jefferson and a 4-cent magenta with Madison. And I saved all these things. And I was able to buy everything, but I think it was the $5 Coolidge. And for Coolidge, who needs to spend $5? But the idea was it was something you really took seriously. And these were great names and everything, and you believed. And I don't think kids today have grown up with presidents that you don't want to remember too much. So.
You haven't said much about the oil sections of your book tonight. I was just wondering, there's various estimates of when the global oil production peak will occur, and I was wondering which ones you thought were most plausible, when you thought peak oil would occur, and what the consequences would be.
Okay, fast on peak oil. You had a peak oil in the United States 35 years ago. There's a certain amount of, I think, pretty reasonable argument for a peak oil among the non-OPEC nations at some point in the next 10 years. And even if you're fairly careful and not too committed to the peak oil analysis, even some that disagree with it think that we're likely to see an oil peak by the 2030s. So whether it's in the 2010s or 2020s or 2030s, it seems to me we have to take a lot of that seriously. It's clearly going to be pressures that can lead to resource wars, and oil is not going to go back to some $18 or $25. And I'm not certain that the people who say it's going to go over 100 are right, but obviously this is a major problem. Now, the last thing I'd say about oil is this notion that George Bush and Cheney and the ever helpful Tony Blair added to the equation, that oil had nothing to do with it. This is obviously total nonsense, because if you look at the maps of Iraq over the last 100 years, they rarely discuss much but oil. The first maps showed where the British and German railways coming in to Iraq and how close they were to the oil fields. Nobody cared about the political map of Iraq. It was whose railroads were going near the oil. Then in the 1930s and 40s, when you had all these Western concessions in the Persian Gulf for oil, the maps didn't pay too close attention to the political boundaries. It was who Caltex had this and British Petroleum had that. If it was British Petroleum yet, it might not have been, and so forth and so on. Those were the boundaries that counted. Then when Dick Cheney was sitting down to map energy policy in the United States in 2001, the maps that he was looking at, and this came from a Freedom of Information Act suit, included a whole group of maps of where the oil fields in Iraq were. Now obviously, they weren't looking at maps of the oil fields in Iraq because they wanted to bring democracy to Baghdad. I mean, anybody who believes that, I got a bridge in Brooklyn that you would like. But Bush and the rest just churned this out. And of course, the first building they took over in Baghdad after the invasion was the energy ministry. And the maps there that they went for right away were the seismic, the sound graphs of the deposits, the oil deposits. The best maps, presumably, that were done in some of the areas that were pretty well explored by the Iraqi geologists. So the notion that this is not about oil is mind-boggling to me, and the ever-vigilant press just don't get into this. And all the stuff we used to hear, and as somebody who was involved in Republican politics, every time they wanted to get something out that was embarrassing, it's the public's right to know, the public's right to know. When was the last time you heard anything about the public's right to know recently? I think that that phrase has slipped back into history because it was suspended by 9/11. They basically took the White House line that you couldn't talk about a lot of things, and I really don't think that the press is putting up information that they would have in a previous era.
In your view, how likely are genuine electoral reform, voting reform, and campaign financing reform to occur? And what would it take for a populist progressive movement to gain enough momentum to begin to change the tide?
Well, laws that are passed in Washington don't mean too much, because as soon as they're passed, you got a lot of people working to figure out where the loopholes are. And I think the most recent estimate is 90,000 lawyers in metropolitan Washington. And as long as you've got 90,000 lawyers in metropolitan Washington, any law turns into a sieve and a Swiss cheese in a couple of years at the latest. So I don't pay much attention, to tell you the truth. I don't know what it would take.
Ask another question. Why hasn't concern about globalization caught on as an issue for the Democrats, and how does that intersect with what you say about oil?
Well, globalization is really more a problem vis-a-vis trade. The globalization of oil goes back a long way. I mean, people were looking for it all over the world 100 years ago. I'm not certain it's too relevant to oil per se, but the globalization and the wish of corporations basically to be able to trade and buy and invest anywhere they want and pick up the labor standards of any foreign country they want and the wage levels, that's globalization. And if you represent the United States, sure, there's a very important elite in this country that profits from that, but the average person no longer does. Some Democrats, in fairness to them, quite a few make that argument, but the party leaderships are tied in with a sort of academic economists who are still running around in an Adam Smithian invisible hand, and it's all good and so forth. And the Democratic economists there aren't too different than the Republicans. And somebody like Paul Krugman, I know Paul and he's a good guy, and he's really changed his views in the last 8 or 10 years in terms of being willing to go up against the academic establishment sort of cosmopolitans. And he does it now. And it's just a group of people that the more you get into this, the angrier you get, so you pursue it. But there really isn't a great desire on the part of the political or economic establishment to push this too far.
We may not be in a part of the country that counts, but I'm heartened by the huge standing room only packed audience here in this meeting hall, for those listening who can't see it. There is an article in the current issue of the London Review of Books that's available online that was written by Steve Walt, who's a professor of international relations here at Harvard, and John Mearsheimer, a so-called realist, a professor of international relations at the University of Chicago, called the Israel Lobby. And among other things in this extensive and I think well-researched article, they talk about the relationship between, there's members of the, prominent members of the so-called Christian right who are part of this Israel Lobby. They identify Gary Bauer, Jerry Falwell, Ralph Reed, Pat Robertson, Dick Armey, and Tom DeLay. Some of the names have been mentioned already here tonight. I certainly don't anticipate some kind of rabbinical theocracy in America, but I would like you to perhaps balance what you're saying about the Christian right with something about how the Christian right works together in coalition, because it seems to me, and so many other people I think are catching on to this, so important in understanding U.S. policy in the Middle East is how they work together within this so-called Israel lobby.
Yeah, I think it's a mistake to call it the Israel lobby. I think it's the biblical alliance. And the minute you put it in that context, you show how really hard it is to attack it, because you've got these ranchers in Texas that are trying to breed the red heifer. That's one of the signs, and they're colluding with agricultural researchers in Israel. And it's amazing how many of the biggest kooks in Israel have come back from the United States. Real red hots. And I don't know how you deal with all of this. And but I think it's a mistake to think of this as an Israeli lobby. It's a biblical lobby. It's Israel's role in the Bible. And that's what, for all these 70, 80, 110 million Christians, I couldn't say how many it is, that's huge. And before it was America, it was Britain, because the evangelicals, and when Cromwell let the Jews back into England in the mid-1600s, it was because he represented the biblical Puritan side of England that wanted the Jews to come back into England preparatory to going back to Israel, so that you could have the end times and the return of Christ. So it's a biblical alliance, and I think it's a great mistake to talk about organizations that are going to go after anybody who says anything negative about them, when the greatest sense is to talk about how many people are committed to all these different views of the Bible, some of the most extreme of which happen to emanate from Israel and not just from Mississippi. But it's a religious thing probably more than it is a lobby thing. I mean, I know how strong that lobby is, but I just don't think it's a wise frontal attack.
Thank you.
You've talked a great deal about the effect of the sort of resurgence or insurgence of religion, and I'm wondering if you have any thoughts about what has caused this upwelling of very conservative religious thought in these. Is it something in the water, in the air, or in
something in the culture, something in the economy? I think there's a pretty clear correlation. If you look at the analyses of fundamentalism by Martin Marty and Scott Appleby and people like that, you tend to get this during a period of enemy and crisis and loss of moorings and so forth. And I don't think it's a coincidence that as for a lot of people in the middle and in the agricultural areas and in the blue-collar areas and poor rural sections, but even a lot of areas that are marginal middle class in the North, as the opportunities seem to get harder and you get more debt, you try to create a value syndrome that enables you to transcend the economic problems. And I think that does explain why these things have overlapped, and that's not what I do exactly, but I think there's a good argument that you can probably come up with more correlations there if you study the people who've looked at those questions. And I think it's true in the United States as it's been true in the Middle East.
I do have a question, but I just thought I would make a comment. I come from a medical background. I'm not a historian or a politician, but I just think that Israel has been a strong supporter of the U.S. It's been a place where we could have support in an area where we didn't always have lots of friends, so I just wanted to say that. My question is more about voter turnout. I heard Rabbi Lerner here a few weeks ago in promoting his new book, basically looking to take back the religious issue from the right and have more people on the liberal side discussing that in political races, et cetera. And has some kind of progressive movement as he goes lecturing. And I'm just wondering, the right has done such a great job in turning out the voter base. And the more they have people congregating in churches, it seems, the more they come together and they can get out the vote. What do you see as a way that the liberal contingency can get out the vote in the midterm elections and then the presidential elections? Is there a way to bring us together?
You mean get out a
more liberal
portion
vote.
Of a religious
right.
vote?
And the secular vote, I guess, because there's so many people of those persuasions, especially young people who just sit out the elections. And I'm just thinking, with such an overwhelming majority on the right who turn out, how do you get people fired up? They've got the abortion issues, the stem cell issues, but what gets the other base turned out?
My view is that liberals have to become somewhat more Machiavellian. And I know this goes against the grain of being do-gooders and everything, but, you know, sometimes you really have to break chops. And one of the things that's most effective in changing the balance of turnout in the elections is that the more ways that the Bush hardline constituency is embarrassed, whether it's by klutzes in Washington or screw-ups and different things, the greater the likelihood that that turnout is not only not going to grow, but is probably going to shrink, because some of these groups have a long history of sort of going back out of the public arena and going back to the religious grassroots and their own churches and parachurch organizations when they get embarrassed. And you know, George W. Bush held up in the right spotlights, I would think could be quite an embarrassment to some of these people, because, you know, he's got to be playing them in different ways. I was trying to remember the different commandments in which one, you know, taking the Lord's name in vain and so forth. Well, if he's busy telling all these Amish in Pennsylvania that he couldn't function if he didn't know that God spoke through him, I would think there may be a little commandment action in that one. But I don't think you necessarily want to, you know, spend a whole lot of money running to look around for the 3 progressive evangelicals in a 4-county section of South Carolina. You know, it's much better just to, you know, sort of shine the spotlight of klutzdom on some of this, and like happened in the after the Scopes thing in Tennessee in 1925. That's what I would do. And I think that the turnout would be far better, for example, if a lot of people, let's say that most of the women in this audience would be middle-class women who probably have a certain amount of spare time. If you all devoted, I see you shaking, okay. But some do.
What?
If you all devoted a fair amount of effort to trying to work in certain sections where an awful lot of young women, whether they're minority or single mothers in professional neighborhoods even where they don't vote. And the turnout in a lot of these groups is pretty low. You know, get them to turn out. Don't necessarily go after the religious vote, but all kinds of women who want to increase turnout in sections could do that. I think it would probably have a fair amount of effect. I wouldn't
Well, what about men doing the same?
Well, what are men supposed to do? Now tell me.
Well, I don't know. You're saying women should be doing this,
Well,
and I
I
don't
mean, if
argue
it's to get
that
the
we
turnout
shouldn't.
of
But,
young women,
how about
yes.
people? I mean, just
Well,
in general.
Yeah.
You know,
Well,
I know there's a real sense of. I know the new book about manliness and all of that, but I think we need to have both people.
Okay, but suppose it's all the husbands that are trying to get all the young
No,
women.
no, no.
to-
I'm not arguing. I'm just commenting. I think all can do it.
Right.
This will be our final question tonight.
Good evening, Professor. The ascendancy, if we look at the year 2005 and we look at the election that happened worldwide, we can see clearly, with the exception of Latin America and Western Europe, which Latin America, of course, from Bolivia to Argentina all the way to Venezuela, they all elected left-leaning parties. Western Europe also has done the same thing, for the exception of the United States, Israel, and the Islamic world. We can see an ascendancy of political religion. For example, the founding fathers of the State of Israel, they were all socialist Zionists, Ben-Gurion, et cetera, they were nationalist secular. Menachem Begin's election in the 70s basically crowned the religious Israeli right, you know, to the spectrum of political control in that state. The same exact thing is happening right now. I think if truly there were an open elections in Egypt, probably the Muslim Brotherhood would have probably gained the presidency today. Hamas is a great example for that, Iran and Iraq as well. So don't you really think that for us liberals, in the true sense of centrists of the word, liberals have not stood up truly and said and expressed to the world and exposed all these forces in the States, in Israel, in the Islamic world, all these religious lunatics that truly wants to push the world into an Armageddon and expose them for what they really are. We have not. I mean, Clinton has always spent the second good part of his term defending rights and programs that were gained a generation ago. What can we do, and what advice do you give me as a young liberal and as a lot of people in campuses all over the states that truly are seeing a layer in the ground for a counter-liberal revolution?
You mean a counterattack on these issues?
Yes, indeed, Professor.
No, I think that's very plausible. There was a group called DEFCON that ran a full-page ad in the New York Times a couple of weeks ago, Committee for the Defense of the Constitution, and it was funded through an outfit called the Tides Foundation, which is sort of a clearinghouse for donors to give money, and it winds up in certain liberal causes. And they were linking Jack Abramoff and the gambling lobby to some of the leaders of the religious organizations. I thought they reached a little bit in a couple of them, but basically, I guess it's just what I've always thought. A lot of that works. Hardball works. The right has done it. The left has done it. You know, the Democrats used to be specialists in that sort of stuff back when the Republicans were trying to get on their feet in the 60s. The Democrats had all the hardball, and they knew how to do it. And somebody told me, and let this be the last comment, which is going to provoke some of you, that the problem with the Democrats is that 60, 70 years ago, they looked and spoke like Woody Guthrie. Now they look and speak like Woody Allen. Change that, you change a lot.
Kevin Phillips.